Hello and welcome to another edition of History Hack. I'm really excited today. Today's guest is Catherine Fletcher.
Now, according to The Guardian, Catherine has, we quote, a very well-deserved reputation as a specialist in 16th century skulduggery and intrigue. She has written books such as Our Man and The Black Prince of Florence, but now she brings us the beauty and the terror. Hi, Catherine.
Hello.
How are you doing with coronavirus? Are you locked in?
I am. I'm locked in my high-rise flat, which really wasn't designed for staying at home, to be honest. It's a kind of little bit of a temporary solution while I'm in the middle of moving house. But you know, at least I have a gorgeous view. I can see the hills beyond Manchester, so that's something.
We'd just been discussing today, actually, Alina and I, like the most trauma that coronavirus has brought us so far. Alina, everyone's burning stuff in Poland, aren't they?
Yeah, so during the winter, unfortunately, the local people decide to burn random things in their ovens, which is not really great because it causes people sinus issues, like me, for example, and the pressure, the snot, it's really, really gross.
Do you know mine? I've had to start like this intensive care regime on my ears because we've recorded so many of these that my ears are getting all dry and crusty from the headphones. So like my cat thinks I've lost my mind. I'm sitting here like massaging like moisturizer into my flaky ears. Oh, it's disgusting. I am disgusting. Yeah. But anyway, let's move away from my flaky, disgusting ears and move on to Catherine's new book.
So, I'm sorry, I can't stop laughing about your ears.
It's horrible. I scratched it and the skin came off. I was like, no, what is going on? First world problems.
I feel so much better about my
Right, shall I make you laugh even more, right? I work for Work Secure, which is a fantastic organisation and that is helping people build businesses in East Africa. And we heard from some of our team in, I think they're in Kenya, putting together a poultry farm. But the recommendation for social distancing in Kenya is that you have to at all times remain the distance at the length of a full-grown cow from another person. That's how they framed it in there. They are in a rural area.
You get into all these, you get into the Father Ted problem of how big is the cow, is it near or far away?
I know, and also, I mean, a length of a full-grown cow, but surely cows are different sizes. It sounds rough and ready to me, but that is what the people in their local area are being told. Anyway, right, have you finished laughing now?
Right.
Can you be serious?
I've finished laughing. I've calmed myself down. So let's actually get started with what we're doing. So the beauty and the terror is much, much bigger in scope than your previous books. And the subtitle of this is An Alternative History of the Renaissance. Why is it different?
I think what I was trying to do was to get away a bit from the popular narrative of the Renaissance that you get a lot of the time. Certainly if you go on holiday to Italy, you take one of the tours, it's a lot about a fairly limited number of great men and great artworks. And, you know, that's all fabulous. I've done those tours, I've led those tours, I have a great time on them. But what that sort of story of, you know, what you might call your Ninja Turtle artists, the Michelangelo and Raphael and so on, what that story doesn't necessarily have is the broader context. Doesn't have the broader context of the wars that were going on at the time, doesn't have the broader context of religious change in the Reformation, doesn't have the broader context of at the beginning of, say, colonization of the Americas. And all of those things are happening in the same world and with some of the same people as are involved in the kind of standard popular version. So it's really about putting together some of the, you know, quite exciting research that's been done by the experts over the past couple of decades and sort of saying, what does that then tell us about the more familiar world and the more familiar names?
I wasn't actually going to admit that my knowledge of the Italian Renaissance literally extends to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but the original ones, not the redrawn ones they have nowadays with the weird little round heads. But let's stick with the actual credible real people. They've changed them. They've got like these weird little shrunken heads now instead of the big turtle-shaped heads they used to have anyway. That is not why we're here. Talk to us about one of the turtles. Talk to us about Da Vinci. I think he's a great example of what you're saying, isn't he? So we remember him for his beautiful works of art, and people perhaps know that he was an inventor. But there's a darker side to his genius, isn't there, that we perhaps don't usually read about?
Yeah, so a good illustration of this is when Leonardo da Vinci first is trying to get a job with the Duke of Milan. He writes this 10-point letter, which is a sort of job application letter saying, you know, what he's good at. And really in all the first 9 points of this letter, they are, I'm good at, you know, this type of military fortification. I'm good at kind of war machines. I'm good at, you know, tunnels if you're going to besiege a city. So he does sort of 9 things that he's good at on the wartime front. Gets the 10th point. So he's like, well, by the way, I can also do art and painting, you know, sculpture and so on. I can sort out this big bronze statue of you. It'll look great. But, you know, if you think about it, in the milieu of the time, it's as important or more important to all these princes to have people who are good at military engineering as it is to have people who are good at art. So that wartime context, you know, Michelangelo is the same. He works on the fortifications for the Republic of Florence. You know, lots of the artists of this period, because they know about things like, you know, perspective and the geometry that's involved. They know about the kind of materials engineering from doing sculpture. They've got these transferable skills, and they're really valued for that military side of their work.
You say, or I think it's implied in the book, that Da Vinci was a bit of a genius when it came to inventing weaponry. Have you got any examples?
Oh, well, actually, I was lucky enough to be in Milan last autumn, and if you go into kind of his museum there, which has got a lot of reconstructions of some of his weapons, and so some of them are almost like a kind of armoured car. I mean, these were not, you know, necessarily used or viable at the time, but, you know, he was thinking them up. So you've got things that are like an armoured car, you've got things that are kind of basically like a sort of almost like a machine gun, which has got, you know, 8 barrels all spanning out so you can get a lot more shots off in one go. He draws these designs for handgun mechanism, which is called a wheel lock. Wheel locks are really controversial at the time because you can hide them under your coat, so it's a kind of concealed carry type of weapon. That was considered, you know, really quite problematic because, you know, assassins and so forth could use these guns, hide them away and pull them out in the street and shoot somebody all of a sudden. So, you know, he's very interested in these new technologies, you know, alongside lots and lots of other things. He makes lots of kind of practical inventions to improve, you know, agricultural production as well. So it isn't just all the murder and violence, but there's certainly a big element of that within his work.
And there's even new things to consider when we talk about even the most famous thing that he ever did, the Mona Lisa, isn't there?
Yeah, well, that's right. So a couple of years ago, Giuseppe Palanti and Martin Kemp produced a book on the Mona Lisa specifically. And one of the things that they kind of identified in the course of that book is the association of Mona Lisa's husband, Francesco del Giocondo, with slave trading. And there's a number of different kind of sort of pieces of evidence around this. And we know definitely that he brought a number of enslaved women, mainly women, to Florence for baptism. And it seems from the numbers seem more to be more individuals than he would be employing in his own household. So probably it's quite likely that he's not just a slave owner in a sense, but slave trader there as well. There's also things where there's kind of circumstantial evidence, but perhaps you know, connected to his trading interests in the Canary Islands and in Madeira, where obviously you've got very strong links to trade in enslaved African people and trade in enslaved Canary Islanders going up to then Portugal and Spain. So although that bit is more circumstantial, where you put the two together, I think it does give us a different context for seeing the Mona Lisa, for thinking about, you know, that portrait, you know, very, very central to the Western canon, and how close the woman in the portrait actually is to this new world of colonial projects.
You've alluded already to Florence, and we associate Florence with beautiful art, architecture. But can you tell us a bit more about about the massacre that took place there?
Oh, you mean the so in the course in well, there's a number of there's a whole range of different kind of massacres that come into the course of the Italian Wars. So I guess the main one involved in the conquest of Florence in 1512 is actually the massacre itself is not directly in Florence, but it's in a town very nearby called Prato, and this is basically a kind of conflict over the rule of Florence between the Medici family, who were its historic rulers, and also and then their enemies in the city who have politically controlled it for the past couple of decades. And what happens is, really, in order to terrorize the Florentines into surrendering, the Medici side and their Spanish allies mount an assault on Prato. So, they put up artillery, artillery fire against the walls. They then break into the city. They go round. There is all sorts of killing. There is torture. There are multiple rapes. There is some really, really hideous methods of torture. Stripping the soles off people's feet. There is. You end up with kind of bodies piled up in the churches. You end up with a kind of desecration of churches. It's all, really horrendous, and it goes on for weeks. And, under the circumstances, it's perhaps not surprising that the city of Florence ends up surrendering. But it's this kind of quite horrific warfare that is the backdrop for, all the things that we now go and see in Florence, the great art, the great architecture, and so forth. And I guess that was kind of one of the things I was trying to do, is to put back some of that sense of terror and the experience of those sort of atrocities into the Renaissance story.
It's certainly something that I don't consider when you talk about the Renaissance. When we do, largely thanks to recent lewd television shows, I suppose, we look a lot at the Medici in Florence, and we all have heard of the Borgias in Rome. But this isn't the geographical sum of the Renaissance, is it? What are we missing out on by doing this?
Yeah, so Florence and the Papal States are two of the large city-states of Italy, but there are three others, and those are Venice and Milan and the realm of Naples, which basically covers all the south of Italy. Then you've got lots of other smaller city-states, some ruled by princes, some of them are republics. So those are places like Ferrara and Mantua and Urbino, republics like Lucca and Siena, Genoa. So all these different city-states are in this kind of complicated political dance. You think this sort of European politics today are complicated. Well, you go back 500 years, and it's this sort of intensely complex process of shifting alliances, not only between the Italian states themselves, but also with the big European powers, so France and Spain, who are both trying to consolidate greater influence, direct or indirect, on the Italian peninsula. So, Florence is a part of the story, but as I would say as well to anybody who's thinking, when we get out of this current situation of going and traveling to Italy, there is a lot more to it beyond the big cities. Mantua is this incredible court with these amazing sort of palaces, frescoed rooms, artworks, churches, and so forth. A lot of the little centres are real kind of jewel boxes of culture then, and they survive today.
I'd definitely be
I'm
doing
sold.
it. Sold.
Exactly.
Alina, road trip, right? When all this is over.
Exactly, but how's this road trip going to work? Do I come and get you from England, or you fly? I think you should fly out to Poland and do it from Poland.
I think it makes slightly more sense.
I was actually quite seriously thinking of doing the whole road trip sometime, and going from kind of London to Rome. A lot of people do the walk now, the Via Francigena, which is the kind of pilgrim route. Go all the way through France and down, and they walk. Apparently it takes about 3 months to do the walk. So if you really, really feel the need to get out of the house in a very big way when this is all over, though, I think that's the thing to do.
If not, join us on our road trip. Yeah,
exactly.
we'll drink lots of wine, eat way too many carbs, and celebrate that all of this is over.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah, go on.
So sorry, let's move on to a bit more about your book. It also tells us about something else that we miss, isn't it right?
So
So again, I mean, the kind of whole great men narrative leaves out a lot of people. I mean, perhaps most obviously, it leaves out women. So women are actually much more involved in the cultural world of the Italian Renaissance than I think we kind of thought. Maybe, you go back 30 years, 40 years, historians are saying, well, actually women didn't have much of a Renaissance. I think now people have reevaluated that and finding that actually there are lots of women, perhaps particularly in the context of war, when men are away, they're fighting, women are left at home, they're in charge of running estates, they're basically in charge of everything. And some of them are very involved in culture, whether that's as poets or writers, rather fewer of them in the visual arts, because that's kind of more difficult to get the training. But there's a very lively cultural life around women, middle class, upper class women, courtesans. There's a woman called Tullia d'Aragona who's a courtesan who writes a dialogue on the infinity of love, in which she kind of both draws on kind of some very sophisticated philosophy and also on her own experience working in the sex industry. So she's just one example. Then we've got other people who are perhaps quite marginalised groups within the mainstream Renaissance narrative. So you have Jewish merchants. Of course, this is the period when we first get the establishment of the ghetto in Venice, which is not kind of the first enclosed area for Jews, but it gives its name to the ghettos that are to come. And that itself is established in a really interesting way in the context of the wars, when there's a debate about whether Jewish refugees should be allowed to stay long-term within Venice. A lot of them had fled there to escape warfare. Some people want to throw them out. Some people wanted to keep them, and in the end the compromise was, well, they could stay, but they would have to stay in the ghetto. So even, all these words and so on that are kind of familiar to us emerge in this particular context of these Italian wars.
So we had John and Emily Jordan on last week talking about their book War Queens, and Emily was particularly taken with Caterina Sforza. She thought she was a great example of a female leader in history. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think Caterina is absolutely fabulous. She is from quite a prominent aristocratic family, although she herself is illegitimate. She gets kind of brought up with the legitimate siblings, and then she gets married to a nephew of the Pope. And she has, there are these extraordinary incidents from her career. So, for example, in 1484, when she's only about 21, she's pregnant, and she actually leads an occupation of the papal castle in Rome, the Castel Sant'Angelo, to try and secure her own family's property after the Pope dies. And then later on, she basically, there's a kind of infamous incident, which is often quite exaggerated in the literature, but which is partially true, where her castle is under siege, her children have been taken as hostages, where she's supposed to have gone up and stood on the castle walls and sort of raised her skirts and said, look, I have the means to make more children, even if you kill mine. So, it's a kind of, it's probably a very exaggerated story, but it says something about kind of her whole attitude and her reputation in the period.
She did sound like a boss, but in all of your research, who is your favourite character that you uncovered, if you like, that you've given to us in this book?
Oh gosh, I've had it really hard to choose. I think Aretino is actually quite fascinating. So Pietro Retino, who is so on the one hand, Aretino is probably best known as a satirist, as one of the first kind of commercial writers who's kind of writing for the market. He writes all this really scurrilous literature about, princes and people in power. He also kind of basically sort of, allows people to pay him to get a more favourable coverage in his work. And he writes a set of poems to go with some notorious pornographic engravings that come out in the 1520s. So he's kind of this satirist and pornographer, but on the other side of that, he's actually also really interested in some of the new religious thinking that is coming out post-Reformation, which is not the sort of thing that you would think goes together. And yet in this strange world, people have the most remarkable careers. And so he also ends up kind of having these discussions about the humanity of Christ. for example, and how we should interpret the figure of Christ. He ends up writing about religion and engaging with ideas from the Reformation. It's quite he is somebody you definitely have a very fascinating conversation with.
We've already touched upon Florence, but we heard from some of our guests the other day when we were talking about war queens. These were really, really savage times.
Yes, yeah. I mean, they absolutely are. They are, and the context of warfare is particularly brutal for women. There's quite a widespread use of rape as a weapon of war. So that comes across. One of the things that I found which I didn't quite sort of expect to find as I was kind of working through all the kind of biographies of the military commanders in this book, was just how many of them just also had allegations against them of domestic violence. So we think of that as kind of quite a modern sort of theoretical thing, linking domestic violence to the then kind of violence in the more military context, and thinking about how to theorize that. But actually, you go back 500 years, and there's a lot of kind of overlap between people who are responsible for violence on the battlefield and people who are responsible for interpersonal violence, whether that is kind of murders of people in the household, kind of what we might now call honor killings, or other sort of attacks against against individuals they know.
I mean, topically as well, people have also got to deal in Renaissance Italy with famine and disease, haven't they?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of scarcity. I mean, you've always got a kind of chance of poor harvests in this period, but wartime really exacerbates that because you've got armies marching through and either buying up or kind of appropriating or stealing, what food is available. So that's a problem already. And you also get new diseases. I mean, the big new disease they are dealing with is the Great Pox, which is probably syphilis, what comes to be known quite quickly as the French disease, the malfrancese in the Italian context, because its appearance kind of coincides with the French invasion of 1494. And, lots and lots of people, I mean, lots of prominent people come down with syphilis. It's kind of a little bit like it's sort of in a way that there's the kind of roll call of, high profile politicians these days who are self-isolating. Well, you've got a fair roll call of prominent people who were basically infected with the pox. Of course, these days we know much more about what potentially causes diseases. Back then, they're trying to work it out, but a lot more people, I think, will interpret it as God's vengeance on a society that has not been living in a proper Christian manner. So there's lots of efforts to kind of clean up the morality of cities in response to this plague. And, you get some quite apocalyptic thinking about, what might happen to us, and this idea that this is God's vengeance.
All of these things are quite internal. What kind of things, external threats, are there towards Italy at the time?
Well, I think at the time, what you've got in Europe is, and indeed beyond Europe, is a lot of large consolidating monarchies almost extending into empires. And Italy, as one of the richest bits of Europe in terms of, the local economy, in terms of the wealth from different types of trade and manufacturing, it's a very attractive place to try and invade or, establish some kind of political influence over. So you've got Spain taking a big interest. You've got France taking a big interest. They both have historic claims to the realm of Naples, so the whole of the south of Italy. You've also got at the same time the Ottoman Empire expanding westwards in a very aggressive way. So they have conquered in the 1520s. They get as far up as Belgrade. So then 1529, they actually besiege Vienna. There's various incursions onto the Italian peninsula as well. So it's not just the kind of the Western European powers that are literally fighting on the Italian peninsula. There's also a lot of concern about what might happen if the Ottomans keep moving west. So that, is a whole different dynamic as well. It's not just a straight fight between France and Spain. It's France and Spain, and then also the kind of third pressure on things, which is the Ottomans.
What lessons do you think we can learn today from the Renaissance?
Oh gosh, I think so I guess a couple of things. I think for anybody who's kind of interested in history, I think one of the processes one of the things I've discovered kind of writing this book is that history doesn't take place in these kind of little silos and these thematic lines that we like to split it into. Everything is mixed up at once. So I think that's a lesson for people who are interested in doing and writing history. More generally, I've been really amazed, and one of the chapters of this book focuses on the history of guns. So I've been looking at guns as a new technology and how states didn't manage people getting access to guns. And I find it just incredible that 500 years on, a lot of the places in the world are still having exactly these same debates. Debates around the problems of concealed carry of weapons, debates around people's right to have guns, debates around people feeling that they need to have guns to protect themselves, whether that's in a legitimate environment or whether it's kind of in a kind of illegal or gang context. There are things that states were grappling with then that even today, lots of places around the world still haven't got to grips with. So I think actually we went back and looked at the states that are more successful in convincing people to respect the rules around that. There are arguments that seem very familiar.
So the book begins at the beginning of the 1490s. Inevitably, you talk about Columbus.
Yeah, and I think getting a sense of the Italian background and the interests of some of the kind of people who are well known as the so-called discoverers of the Americas is really, is interesting, and it illuminates a lot of kind of what's going on here. So you have Columbus, who's from Genoa. You have Amerigo Vespucci, who's from Florence. You have quite a number of Italians who take a real interest and who, although the Italian states themselves are very involved directly in colonization, make really, really big careers out of crossing the oceans, going and expropriating land, going and enslaving people. And I think it's interesting to think about the way that they actually use their particular Italian experience, because one of the things a lot of people don't really know about Renaissance Italy is that particularly Genoa and Venice had quite significant experiences already of running colonies in the Eastern Mediterranean and in enslaving people from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea area. So when Columbus and the like go over to this new world that's new to them, and they have a model already to build on, and their model is the existing small colonies which are through a lot of the Greek islands, which are dotted around the kind of edges of the Black Sea. Although we kind of often think of 1492 as this big kind of break when the shape of the world sort of changes and people encounter each other for the first time, there is this kind of continuity, these existing ideas and these existing practices to build on, and a lot of those do come out of Italian experiences.
That's really amazing. Thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us. I'm sure Alex and I will be getting on and reading the book as soon as possible. So
yeah, I most definitely already feel like I can expand beyond the turtles now when it comes to the Italian Renaissance. Yeah, so you fixed me.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Right, and you take care. Join us tomorrow when you can hear Dan Snow answering questions for a change instead of putting them to other historians. And then on Sunday, it's the big one. It's the Easter Sunday special with Sean Bean and Jason Salke. So we have two of the cast members from Sharp, including Major Sharp himself, talking with us and with our historian, Zach White, about what it was like to make the series and about how they fell in love with that period of history. Until then, stay safe. If you possibly can, stay at home. This is Nighthawk signing off.